Well, my parents were told they couldn't have children, and then they were married for 7 years, and they didn't have any. And then they had 3 happy accidents. And my dad was 52 when I was born, and he said, I probably won't get to see my grandkids, so I'm going to spoil these kids rotten. And you can see the results right here. Well, they had this desire for everything to be fair between my 2 brothers and I. For example, when I was small, I remember one Christmas, my younger brother wanted a rocking horse. You know, the old-fashioned kind that were on the metal frame with the springs. You could really get going on those things. And, that was neat. He wanted a rocking horse. Well, on Christmas morning, my big brother and I had rocking horses too. And they were in descending size, big, medium, and little. And this did not stop even when we got older. When my older brother was married, my dad gave him some money to get started. And then about 2 weeks later, in the mail, I received a check from my father for $1,000. And it said, sorry, I didn't have this to give to you at Tim's wedding. I just want everything to be fair. That was it. Now, I know a lot of you are doing amateur psychology on me right now. Let's put that aside for a moment. The truth is that by nature, gifts cannot be fair. If they were fair, they would be called compensation. The truth is, that's why receiving gifts makes people uncomfortable, because they didn't earn it. State-sponsored lotteries and sweepstakes go through a great deal of trouble to prove to everybody that it is chance that picks the winner. To be fair, it has to be random. To be fair, we think it has to be chance. Obadiah Rodolescu writes that when he was in first grade, he was going to school in the small town in the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Bloc countries, and they had this progressive classwork. And he was studying to be what's called a pioneer. It's sort of a Soviet version of a Boy Scout. And he had worked hard, and he looked eagerly forward to the day of his investiture when he would finally be a pioneer. And to be a pioneer, he wrote, you had to make A's and B's, and you had to never be in trouble. And from first grade to third grade, he had been working hard to earn his pioneer badge. And then on the day when the principal arrived, she had a sash, and she had the scarves and the pins for all who were being invested. And he announced that to be fair, we've decided all of the students need to go through the Pioneer program. And Obadiah said he was furious. And for the next 3 years of his life, he failed every class that he took. He said even the bullies were made a pioneer. So fairness is not always possible, but justice and equity are worthy goals. And that's the idea that we see in the Hebrew Scriptures. Justice. An eye for an eye. A tooth for a tooth. And this was unique in the Greco-Roman culture of the ancient world. They were all about revenge for the sake of honor. And that was the norm in the ancient world. The most famous of which is the story of Paris falling in love with Helen of Troy, stealing her from her husband, Menelaus, and then taking her back to Troy with him, and then Agamemnon bringing all the troops together and destroying a whole city with all the armies of Greece. It's not quite an eye for an eye, but it was all about honor. And so the law of Moses, the eye for an eye, stipulated justice and equity or fairness in punishment. For example, we read in the Old Testament this story of 2 men are fighting, and one of them accidentally causes someone to lose an eye who's watching the fight. Then you shall remove that person's eye. An eye for an eye. It couldn't be can then burn down their village and kill their whole family. It had to be equal. And so this is a step in the right direction for the world. But Jesus points out the problem with it. He says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even everyone does those things. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to receive as much again. In other words, even the mob has a code of ethics, right? So Jesus is calling us to something better. He's calling his disciples in Luke's gospel to something better. He's not just calling us to a way of life that keeps the world from spiraling out of control, but he's calling us to a way of life that can actually change the world for the better. And the first thing I want to tell you this morning is that if we're going to be able to do this, we have to have the view of God that Jesus had. Did you notice in our gospel reading, Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And then he goes on to say, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. God is kind to the ungrateful. God is kind to the wicked. And so we are called to be merciful because God is merciful. This may be the most profound thing I will ever say to you, and it's the simplest. God is kind. God is merciful. God is good. Even to the ungrateful. Even to the wicked. That is what Jesus tells us. And this is important for us to know, and it's important for us to believe. Some of us grew up hearing something else about God. We believed God was like Zeus, waiting to hit us with a thunderbolt if we made a mistake. We thought that God was the kind of God who, if someone is bad, he gives them trouble and hardship and sickness. And if he's good, he gives them health and money. You guys have heard this before, right? Even the mob lives by those rules. Did you know that? God is not a mobster. Some of us heard the message in our churches growing up, and I know I've said this before, but let's be honest, we only have so many good things to say, right? God so hated the world that he punished his one and only Son so that whoever believes in him should feel guilty for forever. That's not what the verse says. Jesus' message to his disciples is a message to us. God is kind. God is merciful. Why is it important that we know that? Profoundly simple thing. I know children who grow up with no hope, who only hear and see the message that their life will not be good, and without some kind of intervention, it's a message they will grow into. And that the reverse is true. A child who grows up hearing from their parents and seeing in their lives that they can do anything, that they can achieve anything, and that they need to go out and do something good with their lives, will probably do some good things. Each of us live into the end or the hope that we have before us. And if we grow up hearing we came from God, that we are made in God's image, and that we will all return to God, who is the source of our life, and if we believe God is harsh and angry and waiting to punish, isn't it just possible that we will be harsh and angry and waiting to punish and get revenge? Being a disciple of Jesus Christ should impact the way we understand God, and that understanding should then impact the way we live. N.T. Wright writes of Luke 6 better than I could ever say it. He says, we must admit with shame that large sections of Christianity down the years seem to have known little of the God Jesus is talking about in Luke 6. Much that has called itself by the name of Jesus seems to have believed instead in a gloomy God, a penny-pinching God, a God whose only concern is to make life difficult and salvation nearly impossible. But this God is different. If you lived in a society where everyone believed in this God, there wouldn't be any violence, there wouldn't be any revenge, there wouldn't be divisions of class or caste. Property and possessions would not be as important as checking to see if your neighbor is okay. Imagine if only a few people around you took Jesus seriously and lived like that. Life would be exuberant, different, astonishing. People would stare. And they did stare at Jesus when he lived that way. So there's a famous story about Fiorello LaGuardia, who, when he was the mayor of New York during the Depression and World War II, he was called the Little Flower by adoring New Yorkers because he was only 5'4" and he wore a little carnation on his vest or in his pocket every day. And he's a colorful character, and he would ride the city's fire trucks. He would show up at orphanages randomly and take them to the Yankees game and buy them all tickets to get in. And whenever the newspapers went on strike, he would get the funny papers and read them over the radio for all of the kids to hear. Well, in 1935, in a bitterly cold night, according to the story, the mayor showed up at night court and he told the judge to take the night off. He put his robe on and he placed himself behind the bench. And the first case was a woman, a tattered old woman, who was charged with stealing food. She told LaGuardia that her daughter's husband had deserted her, her daughter was sick, and her 2 grandchildren were starving. But the storekeeper from whom the bread was stolen said, "The neighborhood is horrible. I get robbed from every day. I finally caught one of them, and we need to make an example of her." LaGuardia sighed, turned to the woman and said, I must punish you. The law makes no exceptions, $10 or 10 days in jail. But after he hit the gavel, he pulled out his wallet, he pulled out the $10, he paid her fine, and then he said, "Now I declare all of you guilty." And he hit the gavel again. "All of you must pay a 50-cent fine for living in a city where a woman has to steal bread to feed her grandchildren." And all in the courtroom, the police, those on trial, and even the man who accused her with a red face, paid their 50 cents. And the New York City newspapers reported that $47.50 was turned over to a bewildered old lady so she could feed her starving grandchildren. And of course, everyone in the courtroom gave Mayor LaGuardia a round of applause. Grace and mercy, the kindness of God, is not fair. And thank God for that. Thank God for that. May we go and do likewise.